it, so I know I don't tend to talk about games a lot on this channel anymore. In fact, I think the last time I ever mentioned a game in a video was about 3 years ago. But I have to talk about Half-Life. So when it comes to games and me, a lot of the time, I tend to be very late to the party, often only checking out a game after the initial hype has died down. For example, playing Borderlands 2 or Call of Duty Black Ops years after their release. But Half-Life, a game that came out more than 2 decades ago, and with the last sequel coming out just over a decade ago, I only got around to playing this year. And as one of the few people who've only just got around to playing this classic series in 2019, boy have I got a lot of things to say about it. So, without further ado, these are my thoughts on the Half-Life series as it stands. And there will be a few spoilers ahead, so be warned. So the first thing I noticed going into the first game was pretty much how dated it all looked. From the overall models to the audio recordings, that somehow sound better on the tram intercom than they do from actual people.
Thank you, and have a very safe and productive day.
Morning, Mr. Freeman. Looks like you're running late.
To how small the text is while playing on a Quad HD monitor. To how near all the scientists look and sound exactly the same. Didn't know Black Mesa was famous for their cloning experiments.
I can't be bothered right now.
But I have to be fair, this is Valve's very first game, made way back in 1998, and while the observations I just made do stand out like a sore thumb nowadays, the whole idea of this game would have been revolutionary back in the day. The game itself ran off a highly modified version of Gold Source, which would later evolve into Valve's own Source engine, which is the engine used for the hit game Quake back in 1996. And while you can see the similarities in how that game runs compared to Half-Life, what Valve wanted to do was create a fleshed out plot and focus on the realism of an ordinary man equipping some guns and fighting off aliens and military alike, with a much larger variety of environments and even puzzles to solve. So you begin the game in the shoes of Gordon Freeman, a 27-year-old theoretical physicist who has his voice missing apparently. I don't know, blame G-Man, who has been hired by the scientific research facility Black Mesa to test out a new sample that the scientists have discovered. Unfortunately, the test goes horribly wrong as a resonance cascade occurs and suddenly aliens start pouring in across the facility. With Gordon being one of the few survivors from this section, it is up to him to wield his crowbar and an assortment of guns to fight off this horde and find out what the hell is going on. And one thing that I do like about this first section is this calm before the storm element that they incorporate. From a narrative standpoint, it does wonders in setting the scene for the player inside this facility, as well as the atmosphere and setting a slower pace at the beginning of the game, which is something I think the game balances out masterfully and throughout the entire showcase. From sections where you're shooting up enemies hoping there isn't a grenade sitting right next to you, to moments where you're simply trying to navigate to a certain section, and occasionally having to swat a couple of headcrabs along the way, all whilst the action and situation is developing around you, from thinking the military's going to help you fight off tougher aliens, only to have them become your next mortal enemy, to them being forced to retreat and abandon trying to seize you due to the alien invasion becoming way too out of hand for them to handle anymore.
Forget about Freeman! We are cutting our losses and pulling out! Anyone left down there now is on his own!
And when it comes to gameplay, you can expect a challenge from this. It's not necessarily a difficult game, but it's not one that will simply hand the answers to you either. You may spend some time trying to figure out how to get past one part, or die several times to one or a set of enemies looking for the optimal strategy to get by them. It subconsciously feels super rewarding that you were able to work out how to complete this task. Although there was one point where I ended up stuck in the vents, ending up completely blind, not knowing which way to turn in the pitch black before realizing several minutes later by pressing random buttons that I have a flashlight on me. Oh, thanks, it would have been very useful to know that earlier, Valve. What are you doing, Mr. Scientist? The gun mechanic in this game works well, offering a good variety of weapon types, with no two types being the same, from the spraying machine gun, to close-range shotgun, to grenades for lobbing around corners, to the high-damage magnum, which you should only use if you absolutely have to, being as there's little to no ammo. And that goes for the rest of them. This isn't a game where you can just waste your ammo willy-nilly. You have to actually pay attention to how much you're using, and what type of gun you're using. But one thing I do have to complain about is why there is no strafing mechanic available. When you press A or D in this game, it just turns your character's head left or right instead of strafing his body. Even though you've got a mouse that can already do that much more reliably, and it just completely throws off where I'm trying to look at. You're meant to weave in and out of boxes to shoot enemies. How am I supposed to do that when I have to move forwards into plain view before turning and facing my enemies who are already facing me locked and loaded? But as you progress through the game, you encounter new obstacles and enemies to get past. From the corridors of the crumbling facility, to the railways leading to the surface, to what looks like the military fortresses set up in the desert, to the alien world of Zen for the game's climax. There's a good variety of aliens to plow your way past, which, like I said before, does require the optimal weapon to overcome, with the Vortiguns usually taking a couple of shotgun shells to kill, and the head crabs only taking a couple swings from the crowbar to swat off, meaning you don't have to waste any ammo on them. Although I do find it quite funny how much parkour there is in this game. I get that they are trying to add a variety of gameplay mechanics into this, but this game isn't a platformer at heart. But while the jumping puzzles aren't the worst I've ever seen, you might find yourself missing a few spaces. What with the default moving speed being sprinting, and the only way to move at a reasonable pace is by holding what's usually the sprint key, and missing a jump and falling down one ledge can cost you a very large portion of much needed health. And the ladders in this game are so hit and miss over whether you're going to go up or down them. Climbing off them onto a platform or even grabbing onto them from a jump at all feels like a life or death experience. It's frustrating, but thankfully aren't seen too often in the game, since this is predominantly a shooter game at its core. But as you progress through this game, you may notice a mysterious figure in a blue suit popping up in certain places you'll visit, seemingly fascinated with Gordon's actions, leaving you pondering just who he is and what his motivations really are. And then you do eventually make it to the alien homeworld of Zen, which possesses some of the hardest enemies and jumping puzzles in the game, until encountering the final boss, which offers up a hell of a challenge to the player, with no proper indication of how to beat it, leaving it up to the player to work out that consistently shooting whilst also hiding from its minions, teleports, and other attacks. And I swear there's no way of avoiding these puzzle attacks once they're launched, so that its head eventually opens up, and you have to try and use the jump pads to land a good number of high damage hits in there, which are surprisingly difficult to land. But after you complete this, the mysterious G-Man finally comes into play, taking full control of the player for the first time and offering you a choice to join him or refuse. But refusing ends up getting you killed, but either way, just ends the game. Now, I thought the G-Man was the main baddie of the games at first, so I refused to comply with him in my first playthrough, making me a little confused that this is what ended up getting Gordon presumably killed, but it turns out you really do have to join him in order for the next game to take place. But overall, this game totally deserves the praise it gets. If you're someone going into it for the first time, you may need to be aware of how different it is to modern games, although I did get used to it pretty quickly after the initial shock. But hey, there is a team of people who've been making this entire game completely remastered for modern day gaming called Black Mesa, which uses the improved mechanics from the Half-Life sequels and, to my knowledge, is very nearly finished, although it is quite a bit more expensive, and I'd probably choose the original one of Valve's most iconic titles and then relive it in gorgeous quality afterwards, because by God they've done a magnificent job on it. But Half-Life is definitely, to this day, a classic game that I would recommend picking up.